Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to bless you with the second part, defensive layers, of my build making guide. In the first one, we covered damage optimization, and I received a lot of positive and constructive feedback on it, and thanks to that, I've layered in some improvements to this video as well. You're going to notice a lot of the game guide texts and screenshots on the side of the screen so that we can be even more thorough with the knowledge we're trying to share here. But keep in mind that I am trying to keep the video within a 30-minute time frame, just so it's a reasonable length. But either way, thank you to everybody who gave feedback on that previous video. I really enjoyed making it, and this one has been a blast as well. Something else I want to highlight is that I've tried to tier the various defensive layers that I'm going to talk about today. And anytime we create a tiering system, those can be highly subjective.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
Even if you get 10 experts in the room, you're most likely going to get some disagreements here and there. Not only that, but also tiers change because of patches. So the information that I'm going to share today is going to be much less resilient to EHG's patches and progress made into the game. But if the document is valuable to a lot of people, I will try to keep it up to date and to add more notes as we learn more about the game. So I hope you enjoyed this video today as we discuss which defensive layers are going to help you optimize your characters and make it impervious to damage.
I'm invincible!
Anyways, let's do this. Irashaimase! Alright, so let's talk about defensive layers. And as I mentioned earlier, I've tried to tier them for you so that you know which ones to prioritize. The top 3 priorities when it comes to defensive layers is critical damage reduction, resistances, and percent damage reductions. So let's start with critical damage mitigation. You have 2 options, 2 affixes that you can utilize for critical damage mitigation. One is critical damage reduction and one is critical avoidance. And the way that crits work for enemies is pretty much the same way that they work for our hero. Enemies have a base crit chance of 5%. And if they do manage to critically strike you, they deal an extra 100% damage for a total of 200% damage. And so you can think of these 2 affixes as essentially crit avoidance is a dodge mechanic on that incremental 100% damage. Whereas crit damage reduction is an armor mechanic on that incremental 100% damage. Anybody who has played ARPGs in the last 10-15 years knows very well that if the percentages are equal, dodge mechanics are worse than armor mechanics. And that is because let's just assume that you're comparing 99% armor versus 99% dodge. If you have 100 HP and the enemy has 100 damage, in the armor case, you can withstand 100 hits. So you're never going to be threatened. In the dodge case, it just takes 1 hit to go through your 99% dodge and you're dead. Dodge mechanics have a much higher variance, and therefore, while they provide the exact same EHP as armor mechanics, they are much more susceptible to one-shots. Which is why crit avoidance is, in my opinion, inferior to crit damage reduction if the 2 percentages are equal. If you look at the strength of the affixes on item slots that are non-chest piece, you'll notice that to max out your crit avoid, you just need tier 7 plus tier 5, or perhaps 3 tier 5s. Whereas on the crit damage reduction, a tier 7 plus a tier 5 only gives you 90% reduction at maximum. However, 90% crit damage reduction is sufficient for you to feel like you can withstand crits and not really worry about them too much. Not to mention that the crit damage reduction affixes come with a secondary bonus of flat armor. I'm really happy that they added this affix. It was very much necessary. Crit avoidance is just far too awkward, and it's a dodge mechanic like I mentioned. And having anything other than 100% crit avoidance just feels awful. On the other hand, crit damage reduction, you can get away with percentages that are not exactly 100, and you're not going to be as vulnerable against one-shots as you are with crit avoidance. One of the few scenarios in which I would consider going for crit avoidance is if my class has some inherent advantage or inherent way of getting free crit avoidance. So for example, here I have Paladin with a passive that can give me up to 40% crit avoidance, making it far easier to hit that 100% than if I used crit damage reduction. And one more exception I can mention for when you might prioritize crit avoid versus crit damage reduction is if your class benefits more from the crit avoid blessing versus the all resist blessing. And these would be scenarios where you can max, let's say, your void, your physical, and 2 or 3 of your resistances without the all resist blessing. Because then the all resist blessing ends up getting wasted. In theory, the all res blessing is 20 times 7, so 140 res. But if it only gives you 4 different types of resistances times 20, then you're only getting 80% of res value. And that's not that significant, honestly. Especially if that decreases even further down to, let's say, 60% res value. If you're at 60, then it's definitely inferior to crit avoid blessing. So Sentinel is a good example for a class that has an easy time maxing out a bunch of different res types, in which case you don't really want to go for the all res blessing, especially if your other blessing slots are free and you want to get those plus 75, let's say, lightning, plus 75, let's say, void res. That just makes the math a little bit more favorable in the crit avoidance direction. Next up is resistances. Those work as you might expect, and as with most other ARPGs. Getting 75%, which is your maximum in resistances, basically reduces all damage of that type by 75%. They're extremely powerful, and they're also one of the few ways in which you can mitigate damage over time. So maxing out resistances is one of the top priorities for most builds and for most season starting characters. Unlike PoE and Diablo, you cannot raise your resistance max beyond 75. It's a hard cap and there are no items to change that. The final top tier note that I have here is percent damage reduction. And that is not something that you can get on prefixes or suffixes of random rare items, but it is something that you can get through skills or passives. And I've tried to list a few here. So here I have a couple for Primalist, 4 for Mage, 2 for Acolyte, and 1 for Rogue. And you'll notice there's a distinct lack of percent damage reduction skills and passives here listed for Sentinel. And I do think the class needs something. The class needs a little bit of help when it comes to survivability. If anybody from EAG is watching, please do add something for Sentinel. It'll be pretty sweet. Another source of percent damage reduction is items. So here I've tried to list a few. Some are better than others, obviously. Some have extreme conditions like 180 attributes. Some are only applicable to certain damage types like elemental damage in the case of this item. Some you need to meet certain conditions in order to take advantage of the percent damage reduction. Like this one requires you to use a two-handed weapon. This one requires you to be moving for that bonus to be active, and so on and so on. But these are just some examples. I don't think I covered every single percent damage reduction in the game. But the idea is percent damage reductions are quite powerful and an excellent way to supplement your survivability with additional defensive layers like that. Once you've maxed out your crit damage mitigation and your resistances, you can start thinking about maximizing as much of either health or ward in your build. Stacking health is pretty straightforward. You just want to get as many health suffixes in all of your gear, basically. Some of the most notable ways, however, are hybrid health suffixes in gloves, belt, and boots, and these can be fairly rare. So anytime you see these ones, you want to prioritize them, especially if they're exalted, and see if you can slot them into your build. And then another surprisingly effective way of boosting your HP is through hybrid health idols. There are these 2x1 idols that can spawn with 5% health max as well as 30 health max on the suffix. And if you fill up your idol slots with those, it is a massive boost to your EHP pool. It makes such a big difference that if you have a build that has idle slots blocked for offensive or utility reasons, and you're losing out on these hybrid health idols, that's a massive detriment to your survivability. So you definitely want to take that into account. Any build that prioritizes something other than hybrid health in the idle slots can be a little bit squishier. You rarely benefit from stacking both health and ward because there are percent bonus stats, which if you're not heavily invested in the item, don't give you very much. There is a special case with ward if you're converting missing HP to ward, which is what everybody calls as the low life build. That special case requires you to max as much health as possible because that health ends up being converted to ward. Here I have tried to list some of the different ways with which you can spec into ward. They're not mutually exclusive. Some of them perhaps are, but many of these can be stacked together it can be beneficial to stack multiple sources of ward generation. So for example, if you have Heart of UK Ross, it doesn't hurt to have ward per second as well, ward per cast, ward per mana spent, ward on hit or crit. You can definitely combo any of these with one of these three. Some of these methods of ward generation are stronger than others. Like Heart, for example, is fairly reliable. In the current patch, missing HP to ward conversion is kind of overtuned, and I suspect this might get nerfed with 1.0. But some of these other options of generating ward can be pretty weak. So for example, ward per mana spent, I have not seen that produce builds that are heavily reliant on it in any meaningful way. Ward per second can be good supplementally. Ward per cast can be really strong if the ward number on the cast is really high. Ward on hit or crit can be useful for certain builds as well. Those are more situational, and some of them have really high value for specific builds. And regardless of which method of ward generation you choose for your build or you optimize around for your build, you're also going to need ward retention. Ward retention represents the speed with which your ward decays. And if you go into the Last Epoch guide, you can see a little bit of comments on ward and exactly what the formula is for ward lost per second. 0.4 times current ward divided by 1 plus 0.5 times ward retention. The ward formula in Last Epoch's guide is not the most useful on its own. However, if you go to Tank Lab, you can utilize their calculator for ward, in which you can specify your ward per second, and I have 100 right now. And then you can specify your ward retention as well. A reasonable ward retention is at least 400, and you probably want to aim for anywhere between 400 to 800. So if you have 400 ward retention, your 100 ward per second translates to 750 stable ward, which essentially means that after 30 or 40 seconds, you're going to reach that ward amount and you're not going to be getting much more ward afterwards. Ward builds can be pretty solid and strong versus one-shots, but can also struggle versus sustained onslaught of damage. Now let's say we have 800 instead of 400 ward retention. The stable ward went from 750 to 1250. Another stat in the game is ward decay threshold, which essentially means that rather than the ward decaying towards the number of 0, it instead decays towards a higher number, which is your ward decay threshold. It seems highly situational, and maybe there is some potential there, but this is a fairly new stat, and my take on it is that currently it's a little bit undertuned. And now we're starting to get into defensive layers in the situational tier, which you probably want to get a few of these, but your build is not going to have all of these, and it's probably something you want to optimize around based on what your class is strong at. So for example, Sentinel can stack armor really well because the implicits on a lot of its chest pieces and helmets have crazy high armor. Now when it comes to armor, the formula in the game is quite convoluted. So I would just recommend to you, you go to Tank Lab and you can take a look at how much physical and non-physical mitigation armor gives you. So let's say you have 3000, then you're mitigating around 50% phys and 34% non-phys. There is a pretty obvious diminishing returns to scale when it comes to armor. So for example, if you have 7000 armor, you're mitigating 71.6% physical damage. And if you can bump that up to double, you can go up to 80.6, which is 9% higher. And if you do the math, you're mitigating roughly 9% out of roughly, let's say, 28% that's remaining in here. You're mitigating roughly 30 to 32% of the remaining physical damage by going from 7k armor to 14k armor. You can also see that there is a hard cap of 85% damage mitigation when it comes to armor, which also reminds me, I misspoke when I said soft cap on armor shred with my first video. It's a hard cap of 85%. Armor shred is basically the flip side of armor. Every stack of armor shred removes 100 armor. You cannot amplify damage beyond 85%. Regardless, getting up to 80-ish% damage mitigation through armor is already a great feat, so I wouldn't worry about aiming for anything higher than that. Frailty is an ailment that you can apply, and it is highly effective versus bosses, because it can stack up to a maximum of 3 times, and each stack reduces the enemy damage that they dish out by 6%. So 3 stacks of Frailty reduces boss damage by 18%. It's a decent addition to any build, especially if you can get like a sealed tier 1 or tier 2 suffix in your gloves or your amulet. That can be a really good solution to having a source of frailty. Endurance percent, again, is very situational. ESG have tried to utilize endurance as a one-shot mitigation where it protects only the bottom part of your life pool. Generally speaking, maxing out endurance is more useful than maxing out endurance threshold, even though once you achieve that 60% endurance percent, you would think that endurance threshold would be a decent investment, but unfortunately, it's a bit of a weak suffix right now, especially because you have to think about, when it comes to a lot of these suffixes, is what are they competing against? And endurance threshold is frequently pitted against health, and health on its own already gives you a certain amount of endurance threshold, as 20% of health is added to endurance threshold. The EHP gained from health stacking in your suffixes is in most cases better than getting endurance threshold. If you have 5,000 health, however, which results in having at least 1,000 endurance threshold, increasing your endurance percent from 20 to 60 essentially doubles the effective HP of that 1,000 health. Ignoring everything else, the 1,000 health with 20% endurance translates to 1,250 EHP, and if you have 60% endurance, it becomes 2,500 EHP. So the EHP out of your 20% of your life pool doubles. Therefore, you're increasing your EHP by essentially 20%. So maxing out your endurance from 20 to 60 increases your EHP by 20%. You do require 3 tier 5 affixes to max it out, however. So it might not be the easiest one to hit, but if you have a little bit support from somewhere else, maybe passives, maybe a unique item or something, endurance percent can be a good investment as well for a situational defensive layer. As I mentioned previously, builds that are highly reliant on dodge can be very susceptible to one-shots. So as long as you have multiple defensive layers within your build, dodge can be pretty decent as well. Just remember, it also suffers from diminishing returns similar to armor, so you're never going to be able to get 100% dodge. The dodge chance graph looks a little bit different on Tank Lab. As you can see, dodge actually climbs faster than armor, and at 7,000 dodge, you're up to 79% dodge chance. And 14k dodge gives you 83 almost dodge percent chance. Glancing Blow is another heavily rogue specific defensive layer. Basically, it is a percent chance for a 35% damage reduction proc on hits. Block chance and block effectiveness are frequently paired up with shields, but you don't necessarily have to have a shield in order to utilize these. There are other builds as well that can have percent block and percent block effectiveness. Block chance is not capped. So this is unlike PoE, for example, you can have 100% block chance. However, block effectiveness is the percent damage reduction that that block applies to the hit. Here's the block effectiveness formula. If you can get up to 5,000 block effectiveness, that is incredible. It's a very, very high value, and that would mitigate 70% of the incoming damage if you happen to proc the block itself as well. Both block percent and block effectiveness are kind of difficult suffixes and just stat lines in general to increase in the game, which makes them highly situational, and I'm not sure that too many builds can utilize them sufficiently and get a lot of value out of them. Attributes, as mentioned in the damage section, each attribute gives you some benefits to defensive layers as well. However, they're not insanely significant. I do want to mention though, with specific builds that stack armor, you can justify investing into strength even just for the 4% armor bonus per point of strength, despite getting no benefit on any damage ability. I also have attack speed as a situational tier defensive layer as well, and that is because many builds are dependent on proc. Ward per cast, ward per hit or crit, even your healing sometimes can be a function of your attack speed, and also reducing your attack animation in terms of number of frames would then allow you to move away quickly and dodge most of the enemy attacks coming at you. So attack speed is certainly a situational defensive layer as well in many cases. Stun chance is a neat one in here. I really enjoy playing builds with stun chance just because of how easy it is to nearly stun lock enemies in Last Epoch. It's a ton of fun. I highly recommend trying out some stun chance, especially if the second blessing, the one from Lagon, does not contain blessing bonuses that you're interested in. The mana or the lightning rest shred are the most notable ones. If you're not interested in those two, definitely think about and consider speccing into stun chance. Cooldown reduction is another situational one. Many of your defensive skills and your mobility skills will have cooldowns, and so reducing their cooldowns will obviously improve your survivability. Endurance threshold we covered already a bit with endurance. I just have it kind of lower down because I don't value it as highly. And these are not necessarily in the order of value per se, but in general, endurance threshold is not in a good place right now. There used to be some builds that would situationally use it. I made a mana stacking static orb, static ground build a long time ago, but that one got deleted unfortunately. And so I'm not aware of too many builds that actually prioritize endurance threshold heavily and spec into it as much as possible. Chill and slow are kind of neat and can give you more room to maneuver around enemies, but also slow down the attack speed of bosses. So they're definitely a situational defensive layer as well. I would only invest in these if I can just throw one passive point wander into chill, for example, for Sork, or if I have a suffix slot on my weapon that is open and I happen to have slow or would like to get slow for whatever reason. Finally, I have Knockback as another situational defensive layer. Ranged builds can benefit from it just to keep enemies at a distance. And it brings us all the way back to the Amazon multi-shot days from Diablo 2. And then I have a couple of trash tier defensive layers. These are very hard to justify, and I don't know of any top tier builds that currently leverage these to a great extent and to great success. Damage taken from mana. If you don't know, 5 points of HP result in 1 loss of mana for this stat line. So let's say, for example, you take 100 damage and you have 20% of damage taken from mana before health. That will result in 20 of that damage being mitigated, and only 4 of that damage will be taken as mana from your mana pool because of this 5x multiplier. And even with this 5x multiplier, this is a very difficult defensive layer to sustain through. You'd have to be running an extremely specialized build. But yeah, currently I don't know of any builds that utilize this. The only one that I know from the past is Static Orb, Static Ground that we mentioned previously. Stun Avoidance is another one that you don't really want to invest into. It just doesn't do much. And then there are a few non-stat considerations that I want us to take into account. And these are a little bit more meta when it comes to defensive layers. The first one is about considering the delay until your main damage source hits. So for example, when it comes to ailments, they are slightly worse when it comes to survivability compared to hit damage builds, because hit damage builds can just wipe the whole screen immediately and not worry about getting hit. If everything's dead, you know, offense is the best defense. But if your offense takes a while to kick in, you might die during that period. So do consider the delay until your damage is delivered onto the enemy. The range of your primary damage skill is also very relevant when it comes to survivability. Some of the highest arena completing skills and builds are not that tanky. They can just wipe enemies from multiple screens away and nothing actually comes near them. So that's what I'm talking about when it comes to range. You could easily have a build that dishes far less damage and is way less tanky than another build. But if it can off-screen enemies, it might just be better, especially for certain activities in the game, like monos and arena. I think those are very much dependent on the range of your primary damage skill. And then another one to think about here is the damage delivery method. For example, there are skills that deliver damage while you're moving, which is far more useful than delivering damage that require your characters to stand still. Spin to win builds or some rogue builds that allow you to proc all of your damage while on the move. That translates to a lot more survivability because you're not standing still and you're not waiting for all the enemy projectiles to hit you. Now that we've covered the defensive layers, I also wanted to share with you all of the recovery methods and highlight some of the better ones. Because if you don't have any recovery, doesn't matter how many defensive layers you have, you're gonna die a lot. So the first one and the best one is when it comes to ward builds, recovery is already baked in. In order to have ward, you have to be generating that ward. And that is essentially the same as regenerating and recovering that ward by default. So when it comes to ward, so this is a really strong aspect of ward builds is that they don't need to worry about recovery whatsoever. And then most other builds, with some exceptions, are going to likely rely on health leech and leech rate for their recovery. One of the best ways to get that for spells and for throwing attacks is through a blessing. When it comes to melee, there are a few additional options, quite a few more options really for melee builds. And then when it comes to certain damage types like Void and Void Knight, there are tons of leech options for void damage, regardless of what type of void damage it is. But overall, this is one of the better ways to ensure that you have recovery in your build. And for certain ward generation builds, like the ones that use Heart of Eukaros, you also want some health leech. After that, we get into more situational recovery methods, like healing. Smite is a good example. It is utilized in some throwing attack builds where you proc a ton of smites and they end up healing you, so it's a really good recovery method. A Primalist has healing totems thanks to Spriggan form, and they're also a really good source of heal. And if you have those, you don't need any more recovery other than that. HP regen is another situational one that is very much build dependent. There is a set that makes it so that HP regen gives you damage as well. That's a situational scenario where you just stack a ton of HP regen. There is also a unique item that makes it so that HP regen gives you ward regen. So those are some exceptions and situational ways in which you can utilize HP regen for your recovery method. HP gain on hit can be decent for some classes, probably more so for rogue than other classes. Especially marksman. I think marksman has a ton of HP gain on hit and crit, so much so that they don't need any other sources. But other than marksman, HP gain on hit or crit is more so a secondary source of recovery. This is not an exhaustive list, however. There are some additional ways of HP recovery, like HP gain on proccing certain skills, or even certain skills have nodes in their skill tree that recover health, and those can be really useful as well. But these are probably the most notable ways of recovery. All right, that's the end of part 2 of my build making guide over here. And for the next part, and I do believe that will be the final part 3, I'll go over mana and resource management. I'm considering having a section on minions as well. And I will talk a bit about itemization. And there are certain item slots that have best in slot affixes. And that's kind of what I want to cover. Not talking about uniques, but mostly just exalted items and where you want to prioritize your tier 7s and tier 6s as you're leveling up and acquiring those first few exalts. And then I'll cover tools and resources, which will just be a dump of a bunch of links. But don't worry, this is not PoE, so you don't need a million different third-party programs to actually play the game. It's not too bad at all. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this guide. And if you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing. And I will see you in part 3, after which I am planning on releasing videos for each class on season starting recommendations for 1.0. So keep an eye out for that as well. Thanks again, everybody. Much love from me to the Last Epoch community, and take it easy. Gochiso sama deshita.